Imagine the court of England in the final decades of the 16th century, a place where the glow of candlelight danced upon gilded walls and poets such as Shakespeare praised the divine majesty of Elizabeth I, as if she were a being touched by heaven itself. Yet beneath the dazzling robes and the stiff ruff that framed her face, there lingered a horror so pungent that foreign ambassadors wrote home in disgust, confessing that the very act of standing near her was enough to make their stomachs twist and their eyes water. For the monarch who commanded armies and broke the will of popes also carried within her body the stench of slow decay. Elizabeth had survived assassins, had stared down rivals, and had ruled with a mind as sharp as any sword. But she carried a secret enemy that could not be executed or banished, for it was the inevitable rot of flesh, accelerated by vanity, fear, and the poisons she chose to smear across her skin each morning, turning her throne into a grotesque stage where beauty and corruption performed side by side. Her smile, remembered in court paintings as radiant and pure, in truth revealed blackened stumps of teeth that clung to her gums like dead branches in a winter forest, while her hair, once a brilliant copper crown that caught the sun, had long since fallen away and been replaced by towering wigs so heavy and foul that worms bred inside them. The courtiers, bound by silence and terror of offending their sovereign, bowed in reverence to what was, in fact, a walking corpse masked in lead and perfume. To approach her was to encounter contradiction, a woman who projected divine power, yet whose breath was so sour that one Spanish envoy described her mouth as a small cemetery, a ruler who insisted on immaculate presentation from every courtier, yet whose own gowns reeked of sweat, vinegar, and oils that could not suppress the odor rising from her unwashed flesh. She feared water with a superstitious dread, convinced that to bathe was to invite death itself, so the royal body was rarely touched by soap or scrub, instead layered with rose water, wine, and balsamic concoctions meant not to cleanse but to disguise, until the palace air thickened with a sickly blend of rot and flowers, an aroma both intoxicating and unbearable. The legend of the Virgin Queen was built upon illusion, upon portraits touched by cautious painters who dared not depict the truth, upon poetry that extolled her as youthful and eternal. Yet within the palace walls reality whispered differently. Elizabeth at table, chewing in agony on food boiled to mush. Elizabeth covering her slumping cheeks with thicker and thicker coats of lead-based ceruse. Elizabeth retreating behind fans so that ambassadors would not see her mumbled speech distorted by ruined teeth. Elizabeth raging at physicians who proposed treatments because to admit illness was to surrender authority. She believed that to display weakness was to invite rebellion, and so she endured torment with a terrifying pride, wearing pain like armor and refusing the mercy of medicine, choosing instead to transform herself into a living statue whose stillness masked the agony beneath. And what of death, that ancient equalizer which spares no king or queen? Elizabeth did not escape its cruelty. Rather, she met it while still alive. For by the time she reached her 60s, her body had already begun to decompose, the lead seeping into her blood and bones, the mercury staining her lips, the wigs carving sores into her scalp, until every step she took across the marble floors of her palace echoed with the footsteps of mortality. When she finally collapsed in March of the year 1603, her attendants were horrified to discover that the flesh beneath her painted mask had already surrendered, breaking apart faster than any embalmer had ever seen, leaking fluids through velvet and lace, forcing guards to change shifts every few minutes during her funeral procession because the stench of her body overwhelmed even the open air of London streets. This, then, is the paradox of Elizabeth I, the queen who stood as a beacon of power, who expanded her empire, who presided over the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and yet who simultaneously became a prisoner of her own image, a woman who preferred rot over vulnerability, poison over honesty, illusion over truth. She chose to appear divine while alive, but in doing so she transformed herself into something monstrous, an idol of decayed flesh, whose legacy was polished to a shine by historians, but whose reality was far darker. For beneath the crown and scepter, beneath the layers of cosmetics and perfumes, lay a woman terrified of being seen as mortal. As we open this tale, understand that what you are about to hear is not a lurid exaggeration meant to scandalize royalty, but a chilling testimony from diaries, letters, and chronicles written by those who served her. those who smelled her, those who fainted in her presence, and later confessed in secret words that they had never before encountered a ruler so powerful and yet so physically repellent. Elizabeth I has gone down in history as the Virgin Queen, the Gloriana, the monarch of a golden age, but the truth hidden behind the mask is one of rot, secrecy, and decay, and that is the journey we begin tonight. Step by step, through the chamber doors of a palace that glimmered with gold, while within it a queen slowly rotted alive. When one imagines the radiant monarch who presided over England's golden age, it is easy to picture Elizabeth I standing before her court with the posture of an empress. Her garments shimmering with pearls and jewels, her face powdered to a ghostly pallor, and her auburn wig piled high like a fiery crown. Yet the moment she parted her lips, the entire illusion trembled, for what emerged was not the pearly white smile of divine majesty, but the dark ruin of a mouth long surrendered to sugar, negligence, and a stubborn pride that refused to yield, even when agony chewed through her very bones. In her youth, Elizabeth had inherited a love for sweet things that mirrored the opulence of her reign. Sugar was no commoner's delight, but a treasure brought at great cost from distant Caribbean colonies, and to partake of it was to proclaim wealth and power, so she revelled in candied fruits, sugared breads, and sweetened wines, believing that to feast upon sugar was to embody the magnificence of her throne. But her body did not share the same view, and by her 20s the decay had already begun to spread, silent at first, then visible in the blackened stumps that took the place of once healthy teeth. Her courtiers whispered of the strange contortions of her face whenever she attempted to chew, the wince that crossed her features even as she tried to maintain composure, the way her meals became softer and softer, until the royal chef, desperate to preserve the illusion of normality, began boiling meats into grey mush so that the queen might swallow without too much torment, and still the pain deepened, sinking into her jaw and radiating toward her temples until speech itself became slurred, her famous oratory reduced to a strained murmur that playwrights like Shakespeare carefully adjusted for, crafting lines that would not demand sharp articulation from a monarch whose mouth had become a battlefield of rot. Ambassadors from Spain and France wrote home with astonishment, describing banquets where the queen smiled politely but refrained from touching the food before her, where she lifted her goblet as though to sip, but let the wine touch only her lips, and where the odour that escaped whenever she spoke was so ghastly that men accustomed to the stench of war camps still recoiled as though death itself had leaned close. One Spanish envoy confessed in his report, "Her Majesty is brilliant in wit and daunting in power, but her mouth is a small cemetery." These accounts, though hushed in the public record, became the whispered truth of Europe, that England's proud rose carried within her a scent not of blossoms but of graves. Physicians who dared suggest remedies met with fury, for Elizabeth equated treatment with weakness, and weakness was something she could not afford in a world that expected women to be delicate and frail. When one physician proposed extracting a tooth, she ordered him never to return, and when another suggested removing a decayed stump, she demanded he first extract one of his own in public to prove it would not hurt. The man complied, screaming in agony as blood gushed from his mouth, collapsing before the horrified court, and Elizabeth, instead of softening, smiled coldly, as though satisfied that her suspicion had been correct. She would not be humiliated, she would not be seen as vulnerable, and so she carried her agony like a secret crown, wearing pain as a sign of unyielding strength. The rituals she devised to disguise her oral ruin became daily performances, rose petals pressed against her gums to mask the stench, cloves and cardamom chewed for their fleeting sweetness, silver-plated utensils designed to catch the light and distract from the black gaps in her teeth. Yet no perfume could overpower the odor that seeped from her infected jaw, and no silver gleam could erase the horror seen by those who dared look too closely. Maids sworn to secrecy described her breath as profane, not the odor of waste or chamber pots, but the exhalation of something that seemed already dead within her. Foreign envoys coughed and dabbed at scented handkerchiefs, desperate to mask the nausea that overtook them in her presence. But none dared speak aloud the truth that the Virgin Queen's smile was the grin of a corpse. What made this spectacle more grotesque was Elizabeth's insistence on maintaining an image of eternal youth and strength. Portraits painted under her command show lips gently parted, teeth gleaming with impossible whiteness, and a jawline firm with vitality. But these were not likenesses. They were propaganda, carefully curated illusions meant to deceive the world and preserve the myth of Gloriana. To reveal her true condition would have been dangerous for the painters, and so brushes lied while courtiers gagged in silence. The result was a monarchy built upon a mask, where truth was buried as deeply as the queen's decayed teeth, and illusion reigned as the foundation of power. As the years passed, the condition worsened until her very speech betrayed her, words slurring together, consonants blurred by the absence of teeth. And yet this too was woven into the myth, courtiers interpreting her mumbling as mysterious, even divine, as though the queen's voice emerged from another world rather than from the rotting cavern of her mouth. State banquets became spectacles of absence, with Elizabeth withdrawing behind screens to eat privately, or refusing food altogether, sustaining herself on broths and soft breads, while her people cheered her as radiant and eternal, never knowing that each smile was a grimace and each word a struggle against pain. By her 40s, most of her teeth had fallen out, leaving only a handful of jagged black pegs that oozed infection, her jawbone inflamed, her cheeks hollowing beneath the strain, and yet she refused all intervention, believing that to admit suffering was to concede defeat. Instead, she grew fiercer in her reliance on symbolism. Red lips painted over cracked flesh, radiant smiles forced through agony, and a strict command that no portrait ever depict her without the illusion of perfection. To her, the mouth was not merely a place of pain, it was the throne of her image, the gateway through which her speeches conquered nations, and she would rather endure the slow torture of rot than allow the world to glimpse weakness. In private, the deterioration reached grotesque extremes. Bleeding gums that stained her linens, ulcers along her tongue that made swallowing excruciating, and a constant ache that radiated through her skull, robbing her of sleep and filling her nights with fevered restlessness. Maids whispered that they sometimes found bloodied rose petals discarded near her bed, grim reminders of the rituals she used to veil her decay, while physicians who attempted to help were dismissed as sorcerers, accused of conspiring to weaken the body of the queen. Her paranoia grew alongside her pain, and the palace became a stage where silence was the only safe response, where truth was punished, and where illusion ruled unchallenged. The tragedy of Elizabeth's cemetery smile is not merely the grotesque image of a queen with blackened stumps for teeth, but the symbolism it carries. A monarch who chose the rot of pride over the humility of healing, a ruler who wielded illusion as power until the illusion devoured her from within, leaving her mouth as a hidden grave that no one dared unearth. The woman who defeated the Spanish Armada and shaped an empire lived with a secret that corroded her very ability to speak, to eat, to breathe without repulsing those around her, and yet she clung to the mask with relentless determination, for she knew that to remove it would be to let the world see the truth, that beneath the crown and the glory, she was as mortal and as decayed as any commoner buried in the earth. Thus, the story of Elizabeth's teeth is not a footnote of royal hygiene, but the first great crack in the mask of eternity, a reminder that power cannot shield flesh from ruin, and that a smile, no matter how carefully painted in portraits, cannot forever hide the cemetery that lies within. And as we move deeper into the tale of her body's collapse, we will see how the same obsession that preserved her image in paintings and poems also consumed her from head to toe, turning the Virgin Queen into something both magnificent and monstrous, a sovereign whose throne was built on deception and whose mouth was the first tomb she carried within herself. The tragedy of Elizabeth I's teeth was only the beginning of the grotesque theatre that unfolded within the walls of her palace, for if her mouth was the first tomb she carried inside herself, then her skin became the battlefield where superstition, vanity and terror waged an endless war, and at the heart of that war was a dread of water so consuming that it reshaped her body, her rituals, and the very atmosphere of her court, turning cleanliness into corruption and transforming the natural act of bathing into an elaborate masquerade of perfume and poison. In the England of the late 16th century, water was not regarded with the same innocent trust we know today, for the rivers of London doubled as sewers, swollen with filth and disease, and physicians, bound by the primitive theories of humours, whispered that water could seep through the pores and flood the very essence of the soul, and Elizabeth embraced these fears with the fervour of one who already lived in terror of weakness, until the very thought of bathing came to feel like an invitation to death itself. So the queen who ruled an empire vast enough to crush Spain recoiled from the touch of the most common element on earth. She allowed attendants to dab her skin with cloths soaked in rosewater, vinegar, or wine, but these were not meant to cleanse, only to perfume, and she would endure hour after hour wrapped in the scents of lavender and musk, while beneath her corsets and gowns sweat pooled, sores opened, and the raw flesh of her thighs and waist broke into rashes that festered unseen. Yet still she proclaimed herself immaculate, for to Elizabeth, cleanliness was not hygiene, but appearance, not the absence of filth, but the presence of fragrance, and so she lived within an illusion of purity even as her body rebelled against her. Foreign envoys recorded the suffocating air of her chambers, where incense burned day and night to conceal the odor rising from beneath her layers of fabric. And one French visitor confessed that approaching her was to breathe a sweetness so sickly and so thick with decay that he nearly retched, describing it as roses soaked in milk left too long in the sun. Yet to speak the truth aloud was to risk banishment or worse, for Elizabeth regarded any mention of her smell as treason against the sanctity of her crown. And so the courtiers bowed with forced smiles, while the stench of their sovereign clung to their silks long after they left her presence. Her fear of water was not content to remain private ritual. It was elevated into a spectacle that masqueraded as grandeur, for Elizabeth did own a porcelain bathtub adorned with golden cherubs that accompanied her on royal progresses. Yet the use of this tub bore little resemblance to cleansing, for the water, always carefully blessed by a priest, was never replaced, only infused with petals and oils as it grew darker and fouler, until the queen sat immersed for hours in what servants later described as a broth of sweat, decayed perfume, and wilting flowers. Her skin soaking not in purity but in corruption, yet when she finally rose, she would be wrapped in satin linens as though emerging from a holy ritual, convinced she had been purified by fragrance and faith, rather than soap and water. The spectacle of her so-called baths became one of the most surreal performances of her reign, for the attendants were forbidden to look directly at her, required to wait in silence as their monarch sat surrounded by rotting petals and stagnant oils, while the air filled with a scent likened to funeral flowers steeped in sour wine, and when at last she stepped out, her flesh appeared pale and wrinkled, yet she believed herself radiant, declaring that the perfumes had preserved her youth, and she would tolerate no contradiction, though the truth was written on the faces of the maids who staggered from the chamber gasping for air. Her obsession with perfume as a substitute for water grew more extreme as her reign advanced. Gowns were drenched in sandalwood, myrrh, and civet until they became stiff with oils, and beneath them her body baked in sweat that no one dared to wipe away. So when she changed clothing, the discarded garments sometimes stood upright on their own, rigid with the residue of filth and fragrance, and still she proclaimed herself the embodiment of divine purity, forbidding courtiers to approach her if they carried even the faintest trace of sweat, punishing them with exile for what she herself carried in abundance, a hypocrisy that only reinforced the atmosphere of fear that pervaded her court. Elizabeth's dread of water was not merely irrational but also theatrical, for she cast it as a spiritual battle, declaring that her skin was a sacred vessel that absorbed power from the oils and perfumes, that sweat itself was a divine cleanser of the soul, and that water was the enemy that would wash away her essence. And in her refusal to bathe, she elevated her own stench into something untouchable, even holy, so that those around her learned to treat the odor not as shame, but as a manifestation of majesty, an inseparable part of the throne itself. Yet her body betrayed her despite her convictions. Rashes spread across her back and thighs, open sores wept beneath her corsets, flakes of dried perfume clung to her arms like scales, and physicians pleaded with her to allow them a simple washing to ease the infection. But she accused them of sorcery and drove them away, convinced that their advice was a plot to weaken her, for paranoia had become her shield as much as powder and perfume, and so the Virgin Queen chose to endure agony rather than permit the healing touch of water. The irony is cruel. A woman who ruled an empire through strength of will allowed herself to be undone by fear of the very substance that sustains life, and as her reign lengthened, her body grew ever more fragile, trembling with the symptoms of poisoning from the paints and perfumes she layered upon herself. Yet she persisted, believing that her divinity demanded it, that to expose her skin to cleansing water would be to confess mortality, and mortality was the one truth she could never permit her people to see. Thus the fear of water, absurd in its superstition, became a pillar of Elizabeth's mythology, for it enabled her to maintain the illusion of a queen untouched by human weakness, a woman whose fragrance was inseparable from her power, even as that fragrance masked a body quietly dissolving beneath layers of rot. The courtiers and diplomats who survived the suffocating air of her presence carried away memories they dared only record in secret letters, of a monarch whose very body exhaled corruption and yet whose authority remained absolute, a paradox so grotesque that history itself has tried to soften it. But the truth lingers like a sickly perfume, that Elizabeth I, in her terror of water, transformed herself into a living reliquary of decay. And as the years pressed on and her obsession deepened, the consequences spread beyond smell and sores. For the very skin she fought to preserve began to rebel in ways more terrifying still, forcing her to turn to even deadlier substances to conceal the damage, until paint became her armor and poison her mask. And what began as a fear of bathing ended as a descent into chemical self-destruction. The fear of water that had turned Elizabeth I's skin into a canvas of sores and rashes eventually led her toward another obsession, one that would become both her salvation and her doom. For if she refused to cleanse her flesh with soap and water, then she would cleanse it with illusion, layering over the cracks and pits of disease a mask so thick that her very face ceased to belong to her, a mask of paint and powder that shone like marble in candlelight, but carried in its whiteness the seeds of her destruction, and thus began the long and terrible reign of the poisoned mask. In the year 1562, Elizabeth survived smallpox, a disease that scarred her with pits and marks across her once smooth skin, and though she endured the fever and lived, the scars became for her an enemy worse than any foreign invader, for the Virgin Queen could not bear to be seen as marred or mortal, and so she turned to a cosmetic called Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar praised across Europe for its ability to give women a ghostly pallor that suggested purity and nobility, yet cursed in whispers for the poison it carried. For those who wore it too long often sickened, trembling with madness, their flesh breaking apart beneath the shining mask. Elizabeth embraced it with a fanatic devotion, applying it daily in thick layers, building upon yesterday's paint with today's, until her skin no longer breathed, and what had begun as concealment transformed into an armor, a second skin that trapped her flesh beneath, sealing sores and ulcers under a smooth white crust that cracked and bled whenever she forced a smile. But still, she continued, for to her the paint was not vanity but sovereignty, proof that she remained eternal, untouchable, and divine. Her ladies-in-waiting recounted that when she sat for portraits, her skin shimmered like alabaster, glowing with a supernatural brilliance that made poets describe her as silver-skinned. Yet they alone knew the horror beneath. For when the mask was removed, if it was removed at all, it revealed cheeks riddled with ulcers, lips fused by sores, and patches of flesh that had already begun to slough away. And so more paint was applied, layer after layer, until the illusion was restored and the truth buried once more, as though the very act of painting was an exorcism to drive away mortality. But the poison could not be denied, for lead seeped into her blood, lodging in her bones, corrupting her organs, and over the years she developed the symptoms that now we recognize as lead poisoning, tremors that made her hands quiver, even as she signed decrees, sleepless nights filled with paranoia and hallucinations, a quick temper that erupted into screams at maids who spilled powder or failed to mix the paste correctly, joint stiffness that forced her once graceful figure into a hunched posture, and a yellowing of the skin beneath the paint that only demanded still more layers of the lethal substance, feeding the cycle of concealment and decay. Nor was ceruse her only weapon in this war against time, for she painted her lips with vermilion, a pigment made of mercury sulfide, toxic in its own right, which cracked her bleeding mouth into a semblance of color even as it poisoned her blood further, and she rimmed her eyes with lamp black made from soot and ash, and dilated her pupils with drops of belladonna that blurred her vision, but made her gaze appear larger, more commanding, more divine, until her very body became a temple consecrated to poison, each part of her face a shrine painted with death. The transformation was slow, yet unmistakable, for by her 40s, the expression that once animated her face with intelligence and wit had stiffened into something mask-like, her smile frozen, her cheeks unable to stretch without splitting. And though portraits continued to depict her as serene and eternal, the stillness in those images was not the serenity of a goddess, but the paralysis of a woman, trapped beneath her own disguise, bleeding beneath her beauty, suffering beneath her sovereignty. Her attendants whispered of the rituals each morning, when the queen sat beneath candlelight while oils, powders, paints and perfumes were layered upon her, the process taking hours until she emerged radiant, but faint, often collapsing from exhaustion before the day even began. And though her physicians knew the fainting was a symptom of poisoning, they dared not say so, for to suggest that her beauty was killing her would have been to strike at the very foundation of her power, and Elizabeth allowed no attack upon her illusion. One maid later confessed that peeling away the paint revealed wounds so raw that she vomited from the sight, only to be struck by the queen's hand for daring to show disgust. And in this act, we see the deepest tragedy of Elizabeth's poisoned mask. For it was not simply that the paint destroyed her flesh, but that the mask itself demanded loyalty, demanded complicity, demanded that those who saw the truth must deny it. And so an entire court conspired in silence, keeping alive the myth of eternal beauty, while their queen slowly rotted beneath the paint. As the decades wore on, the consequences became unavoidable. Her body racked with pain, her fingers curling into claws from joint damage, her skin yellowing beneath the surface, her back bending beneath the burden of years and poisons. Yet each morning she returned to the ritual. Each evening she stood before her people as Gloriana, eternal and untouchable. And each night she collapsed in her chambers, weary and corrupted, her pillow stained with traces of the very powders that were killing her. This obsession with the mask reveals the profound paradox of Elizabeth I, for she was a ruler who commanded armies, defied popes, and expanded empires. Yet she was also a woman enslaved to the terror of her own reflection, who banished mirrors from her chambers so she would never be forced to see the horror beneath the paint, and who clung to poison with the devotion of a priestess, believing that without the mask she would cease to be queen at all, that to reveal her true flesh was to surrender her crown. In the end, the poisoned mask did more than preserve an illusion. It consumed her, and by the time she approached her final years, she no longer existed apart from the disguise. Her true face dissolved into sores and scars while the painted visage stood in its place. A grim irony that the Virgin Queen, celebrated in history as radiant and eternal, was in truth a living corpse, who had entombed herself within a coffin of paint, a sovereign who proved that power can command armies and poets, but cannot halt the quiet march of poison through the veins. And so the story of Elizabeth's mask becomes a warning written not in chronicles alone, but in the very remains of her body. For when the embalmers at last stripped away the paint after her death, they recoiled in horror at the ruin beneath. Cheeks riddled with abscesses, lips fused together, forehead flaking, eyes sunken and bloodshot, the visage of a woman who had died long before she stopped breathing. And yet this is only one chapter of her descent, for the mask she wore upon her face was mirrored by the monstrous crown she wore upon her head. A crown not of gold but of hair, glue, powder, and vermin. And that is where our story next must turn, to the wigs of Elizabeth, which concealed beneath their grandeur a horror even greater than paint. If the poisoned mask upon Elizabeth I's face was the first wall she built to shield her people from the truth of her decay, then the strange and towering wigs that crowned her head became the second, a structure even more grotesque, because it did not simply cover the signs of mortality, but transformed them into monuments of illusion so heavy, so elaborate, and so poisonous, that they turned her body into a battlefield, where vanity and pain struggled until one consumed the other. And to speak of these wigs is to enter a world where hair was no longer hair, but an artifact of fear, glued, powdered, and perfumed into constructions that were both magnificent and monstrous. In her youth, Elizabeth's natural hair had been her pride, a coppery blaze that caught the sunlight and gave her the appearance of a goddess descended into the mortal world, and poets compared it to flames or to the rays of dawn. But as she aged, and as the poisons of her cosmetics seeped into her blood, and pores her once lustrous mane began to fall in handfuls, until by her late 30s her scalp was bare in places, raw from sores, and too fragile to be seen, and for a queen whose image had become the very foundation of her reign, This loss was not merely cosmetic, but existential. For to lose her hair was to lose her symbol of vitality, and so she turned, as she had turned with her skin, to illusion. The wigs she commissioned were unlike anything seen before, rising in towering shapes sculpted from horsehair, goat hair, and, most disturbingly, the hair of her own servants or of the dead, bound together with a paste of animal fat, starch, and eggs that hardened into a sticky crust, then powdered with the same poisonous substances she smeared upon her face, and scented with lavender and musk in a desperate attempt to disguise the musty odor that clung to them. Yet these adornments, though magnificent in appearance, were filth in substance, unwashed for months to preserve their fragile construction and crawling with lice, fleas, and, as servants whispered in terror, sometimes maggots that burrowed into the sores of her scalp. One attendant recorded in secret that upon lifting one of these wigs from the queen's head, he discovered writhing white larvae near the crown of her skull. And though horror nearly forced him to cry out, he remained silent, for to reveal the truth was to invite death. And so he dusted the area with powder, poured lavender water upon the wound, and replaced the wig, restoring the illusion at the cost of his own conscience. And this silence became the law of her court, a conspiracy of attendants and courtiers who bowed before the grotesque crown as though it were sacred. The rituals that surrounded the wigs elevated them beyond mere fashion into ceremonies of power. Each morning, Elizabeth sat surrounded by attendants, guards, and even a priest who blessed the wig before it touched her head. And when a strand fell loose, it was buried with solemnity, as though her hair were relics of a saint. And if during court the wig shifted or sagged, the entire proceeding halted until it was corrected, for the crown of hair had become as holy as the crown of gold, and to question it was to question the majesty of the queen herself. Some wigs were so vast that alterations had to be made to the very architecture of her palaces, archways widened or raised, so that she could pass through without disturbing the monstrous creation perched upon her scalp, and one was said to weigh nearly 20 pounds, forcing Elizabeth to wear a steel collar beneath her gown to support the burden. While beneath the weight her skin broke open in sores, blood seeped into the padding, and infections spread. Yet still she refused to abandon the disguise, declaring, "My scalp serves not your peasant hypotheses, it upholds the crown," a phrase that captures the essence of her madness. For to her the pain of bleeding flesh was preferable to the humiliation of being seen as bald. Foreign ambassadors commented in letters not on the beauty of her wigs, but on the strange musty smell that accompanied her wherever she went. An odor that was neither sweat nor perfume but something organic, like damp earth or rotting wood. And one Italian diplomat described it cruelly as a garden that blooms not with roses but with decay. Yet these words were written in secrecy, for to utter them aloud in London was unthinkable, and one noblewoman who dared whisper that the Queen's hair resembled the scent of tombs found herself banished to Cornwall within the week, a warning that silence was the price of survival in the presence of the Virgin Queen's illusions. The maintenance of these wigs was itself a grotesque ordeal. When removed, they were stored in locked rooms, guarded at night like sacred treasures, and washed not with soap and water, but with vinegar baths, and dried hastily over hot coals, though never fully cleansed, so that mould grew within the linings, feeding upon the mixture of starch and fat, and when the wigs were returned to her head, the spores and filth mingled with her open wounds, accelerating the rot that spread across her scalp. And still she persisted, convinced that to expose her head would be to expose the kingdom to fracture, as if the hair itself was the glue that held England together. By the early years of the 17th century, the damage had become irreversible. Her scalp deteriorated so badly that she was forced to wear an iron mesh cap beneath the wigs, which gouged her skin and left her faint with pain. And one servant recorded that she collapsed during a court meeting from infection, yet the wig was reapplied before she regained consciousness. For ceremony demanded that the illusion never falter, and so her body became a puppet, dressed and adorned for the theatre of monarchy even as it decayed beneath the weight of lies. Modern historians who examined records have concluded that the lead powder used to whiten the wigs likely seeped into her bloodstream through her broken scalp, worsening the lead poisoning already, ravaging her body from the ceruse on her face, and the tremors, fainting spells, confusion, and paranoia she suffered in her final years may all have been magnified by this cruel crown, making the wigs not merely symbols of vanity, but instruments of slow suicide. And yet Elizabeth clung to them with a devotion that bordered on religious mania, for they were more than coverings. They were emblems of authority, the visible proof that she remained majestic even as her flesh dissolved. When she lay dying in the spring of 1603, she insisted that a wig be placed upon her head, so that even in her last breaths she might maintain the image of eternal youth. And when the embalmers came, they dared not remove it, fearful of what horror might lie beneath. And so she was buried, still crowned with horsehair and powder, the wig pressed down upon her skull like the final seal of a life lived within deception. And thus the crown of wigs became not only a mask for the living queen, but also the final shroud of the dead one. The tale of Elizabeth's wigs is not merely grotesque fashion, but a metaphor for her reign. For just as she built a kingdom on illusion, propping up the myth of the Virgin Queen, while hiding the rotting truth of her body, so too did she balance these monstrous crowns upon her wounded head, smiling in portraits while suffering in silence, commanding her people with grandeur while bleeding beneath the disguise. And in this paradox lies the enduring fascination of her story. That power, when shackled to vanity, can construct monuments of magnificence that stand not upon stone or gold, but upon flesh that slowly rots away. And yet even this horror was not the final act. For the true climax of Elizabeth's grotesque transformation came not while she lived, but after she died, when her poisoned flesh, long held together by paint, perfume, and wigs, finally gave way to decomposition so swift and so foul that her funeral itself became a scandal of odor and decay. And so our story must next follow her beyond the grave, into the chamber where her body collapsed into corruption faster than any embalmer could conceal. For if the crown of wigs was her final mask in life, then the spectacle of her death was the mask torn away. By the time Elizabeth I entered the closing years of her reign, the poisons she had embraced as the scaffolding of her eternal image had sunk so deeply into her veins and bones that her body itself rose in rebellion, and what had once been a gradual creeping decay hidden beneath paint and wigs now erupted into visible collapse, a revolt of the flesh that no perfume could disguise and no portrait could correct. Yet even then, the queen clung stubbornly to the illusion, choosing agony over vulnerability, illusion over honesty. And in doing so she transformed her body into a living battlefield where her own organs, muscles, and skin fought against her desperate will to remain immortal. The signs were everywhere for those who dared to look closely. Tremors coursed through her hands whenever she attempted to sign decrees, her once graceful fingers curling into stiff claws that betrayed the lead lodged in her bones. And though courtiers bowed to the sweeping motions of her signature, they whispered privately that it looked more like the scratch of a dying woman than the flourish of a monarch. Yet none dared say so aloud for fear of banishment. And so the trembling hand was mythologized as divine fervor, the instability of her script transformed into evidence of heavenly inspiration rather than of poisoning. Her sleeplessness grew worse with every passing season, for lead and mercury gnawed at her nervous system, leaving her restless, suspicious, and prone to bursts of rage that terrified her attendants. And the once witty queen, whose sharp tongue charmed poets and confounded ambassadors, became unpredictable, one moment laughing in forced gaiety, the next screaming accusations of treachery at maids who spilled a drop of perfume or dared to linger too long with a mirror in hand. And her paranoia seeped into every chamber of the palace until silence became the law, for no one knew what trivial misstep might provoke her fury. Her appetite diminished as chewing became torture, her blackened stumps of teeth refusing even soft bread, and the royal kitchens adapted by boiling all meals into mush. Yet even this proved too painful, and so Elizabeth grew gaunt, her once strong jawline sagging beneath the weight of infection and age, her cheeks hollowing until she appeared as spectral in life as the portraits tried to preserve her in art. And still she commanded that no painter show her thinness, ordering instead the eternal mask of rosy cheeks and plump lips that existed only in pigment, while her real face collapsed into ruin. The revolt of her body spread further into her skin, where sores opened beneath corsets that had not been loosened in years, the flesh beneath her garments erupting in rashes that wept with pus. And attendants, sworn to secrecy, described in hushed recollections how flakes of dried perfume and paint clung to her arms like scales, peeling away to reveal ulcers beneath, Yet when physicians begged her to allow washing with simple water, she shrieked accusations of sorcery, her fear of bathing so deep that even the touch of ointment upon her ears was enough to drive her into hysterics. And thus the infections deepened, concealed under layer upon layer of powder, until her body became a mausoleum wrapped in silk. What made the spectacle more tragic was Elizabeth's iron refusal to acknowledge defeat, for even as her spine curved into a hunch and her joints locked with stiffness, she demanded to be dressed in gowns that weighed as much as armor, layered with jewels, corsets, and farthingales, so that her attendants were forced to strap her into magnificence, while her flesh cried out in rebellion beneath the crushing weight. And when she appeared in public, the people saw only the glittering Virgin Queen, resplendent as ever, while those closest to her heard the muffled groans of a woman trapped inside her own costume. Her mind, too, began to fracture under the strain of toxins, and what had once been sharp cunning gave way to suspicion and despair, for she accused her most loyal servants of betrayal, sent messengers running in circles to verify plots that did not exist, and muttered in sleepless hours about shadows conspiring against her. Yet she forbade any sign of weakness to be shown outside her chamber, and so her paranoia was hidden like her sores. Wrapped in silence while the mask of majesty shone outward, a mask no less deceptive than the lead paint on her cheeks. The revolt of the body was relentless, spreading even to her hair, or what remained of it beneath the wigs, for her scalp, festered with infections that oozed whenever the heavy crowns of horsehair pressed against her skin, and though blood sometimes soaked through the linings, her attendants had no choice but to reapply the wig and powder it once more, lest the court see the truth, and so each ceremony became a dance of deception, with servants fanning away the sickly odour, musicians playing louder to drown out the queen's groans, and courtiers bowing as if before divinity, while in reality they were bowing before the smell of decay. By the early 17th century, the revolt had reached a point where her body no longer obeyed her will, and she found herself fainting during meetings, collapsing into her throne while attendants rushed to steady her. Yet even then the wig was adjusted, the paint reapplied, and the illusion restored before the public could suspect. And thus, her life became an endless cycle of collapse and concealment, of weakness hidden beneath ritual, until she seemed less a human sovereign than a puppet held together by powder, pins, and perfume. It is tempting to see in this revolt of the body a form of poetic justice, as though the very flesh she had denied and suffocated in her quest for divinity rose up to destroy her. Yet it was also profoundly tragic, for Elizabeth had built her power on the myth of eternal youth. And when her body rebelled against that myth, she had no choice but to double down, smothering every sign of decay beneath still more layers of poison, until her final years were lived, not in triumph but in torment, not in freedom but in chains of her own making, chains woven from fear of mortality. Those who served her during these final years later confessed that her chambers had become like a tomb, heavy with incense, thick with the odour of sores and sweat, and filled with the queen's mutterings as she wandered sleepless through the night, refusing to lie down lest she never rise again. And it was in these nights that her body's revolt reached its climax, for she could no longer eat, no longer sleep, no longer trust even her own reflection, and she ordered mirrors banished from her presence, so that she might never again glimpse the ruin beneath the mask. The revolt of her body was complete by the spring of 1603, when Elizabeth's flesh at last surrendered, but even then the illusion was maintained, for attendants dressed her in her finest gowns, reapplied her paint, and crowned her with a wig as though she were still alive, unwilling to allow the world to see the truth. Yet when death finally claimed her, the mask could not hold, and her body decomposed at such speed and with such violence that the court was forced to confront the horror it had long denied, a horror that began with trembling hands and bleeding gums, but ended in the collapse of the entire illusion. Thus, the revolt of Elizabeth's body was not a private affair, but a spectacle that exposed the limits of power, for no crown, no portrait, no myth could stop the slow uprising of flesh against poison, and no queen, however mighty, could halt the truth that beneath paint and perfume everybody returns to dust. The Virgin Queen had spent her life building an image untouchable by time, yet her body rebelled, betrayed her, and in doing so revealed the inevitable fate of all who worship illusion over truth. And yet even this revolt was not the final act, for the most ghastly chapter came only after her last breath, when the body that had resisted water, embraced poison, and borne wigs like monuments of death erupted into a decomposition so rapid and so foul that her funeral itself became a theatre of horror. And so to understand the true end of Elizabeth I, we must now follow her beyond life, into the spectacle of her corpse, where the illusions she had clung to for decades dissolved at last into stench, corruption, and the silence of the grave. By the final winter of Elizabeth I's reign, the revolt of her body had already announced itself with tremors, sores, and paranoia. Yet the Queen refused to relinquish either her throne or her illusions, and so she entered her last days as a figure caught between life and death, a sovereign who sat stiff in her velvet robes, while within the shell of her body, the poisons she had chosen conspired with age to consume her, and the courtiers who once praised her brilliance now watched in fearful silence as their monarch transformed into a shadow of her former self, too proud to admit weakness, too terrified to lie down lest she never rise again, and thus her final weeks became a slow procession toward the grave that was already forming inside her. She withdrew into her private chambers, draped in heavy hangings that trapped incense and candle smoke, and there she passed sleepless nights pacing the floorboards, whispering half-coherent words about fate, betrayal, and eternity, her eyes red from exhaustion, her lips cracked and bleeding beneath layers of vermilion paint, her fingers curled into claws from the stiffness of lead poisoning, and her skin yellowing beneath the whiteness of Venetian ceruse. And though her ladies begged her to rest, she shook her head with a quiet certainty that if she closed her eyes, she would never open them again. And in this conviction she was correct, for sleep had become indistinguishable from death. Food no longer tempted her, for chewing brought only agony, and even broth slipped down with difficulty. So she grew gaunt, her bones showing beneath silks and corsets, her once commanding presence reduced to a figure almost skeletal. Yet she still demanded the weight of her gowns and jewels, still insisted on the rituals of paint and wigs, as though these tokens could anchor her soul to the world a little longer, and the attendants who dressed her did so with tears, knowing they were strapping grandeur upon a body that was already collapsing, a corpse in rehearsal for its own funeral. Her counsellors tried to press her for decisions about succession, urging her to name James of Scotland as heir, but she refused to speak, retreating into silence that unnerved all who sought her judgment, for the Queen who had once outwitted popes and emperors now sat staring at nothing, her lips sealed, her breath shallow, her eyes vacant, and courtiers whispered that perhaps her silence was not mere exhaustion but a last defiance, a refusal to acknowledge mortality by refusing to speak its name. And so the kingdom waited in dread, while its monarch drifted further into the shadows of death. The chambers themselves bore witness to the transformation. Incense burned day and night to combat the smell of her failing body, yet the odour grew stronger, a mixture of perfume and putrefaction that clung to velvet hangings and sickened attendants, and servants rotated frequently because no one could endure long in the miasma, and one maid fainted upon entering, another vomited behind a curtain. And yet the rituals continued, powders reapplied, wigs adjusted, gowns arranged, as if pretending could still make real the fiction of her eternal divinity. Elizabeth sat upon cushions, refusing to lie flat, her spine bent, her head heavy with wig and jewels, her lips whispering prayers or curses, too soft to be understood, and when the Archbishop urged her to prepare her soul, she dismissed him with a flick of her trembling hand, for she had no wish to speak of endings, no desire to confess weakness, and though her body screamed of mortality, her spirit clung to sovereignty, as though sheer will could keep her upon the throne, even as the throne itself became her deathbed. The courtiers who gathered outside her chamber described an eerie hush that fell upon the palace, for the Queen no longer plotted, no longer spoke with fire, no longer raged or laughed, but sat in stillness like a statue, and the silence spread outward into every corridor, as if the entire realm held its breath, waiting for a sound that would never come. And so the Virgin Queen's last days were marked not by proclamations but by absence, not by triumph, but by a hush so heavy it seemed to foretell doom. When at last death came in March of the year 1603, it arrived not gently but with grotesque swiftness, for the poisons that had accumulated in her body for decades now erupted, and decomposition began almost instantly, shocking the attendants who had believed they were caring for a body still warm with life, and within hours her flesh had begun to swell, her lips darkening, her eyes sinking, fluids seeping from nostrils and ears, and the odor that filled the chamber was so overpowering that the doors were ordered shut and guards posted to prevent anyone from entering, though even the guards struggled to stand their watch without gagging. The physicians, attempting to explain the horror, blamed damp weather, candles placed too close to her skin, or the natural frailty of age. But the truth whispered among them was darker, that Elizabeth had been slowly embalming herself with poisons while still alive, and at death the fragile balance broke, releasing the corruption all at once, so that her body decayed faster than any embalmer had ever witnessed, and the scandal of her flesh threatened to overshadow the glory of her reign. They attempted remedies, burning stronger herbs, scattering roses across the chamber, placing bowls of vinegar beneath the bed, but nothing masked the stench, and attendants collapsed or fled, while the most loyal maids forced themselves to remain, covering their mouths with cloths soaked in perfume, their eyes watering as they continued their duties. Yet even they could not bear it long, and so the chamber of the Virgin Queen became a place of isolation, guarded and feared, her corpse transforming into a symbol of the very decay she had tried all her life to deny. The embalming proved nearly impossible, for when the morticians removed the final layer of paint, they recoiled at the sight of cheeks riddled with abscesses, lips fused together, forehead flaking, skin around the jaw entirely shed, and eyes red and sunken, and their tools failed against the fragile, poisoned tissue that disintegrated at their touch. And so they resorted to deception, sewing her lips shut, covering her neck with lace, painting a wax mask of serenity upon her face, and dressing her hands in gloves to conceal the darkened skin, until what was displayed to the public was not Elizabeth, but a grotesque mannequin of her former self, beautiful in appearance, putrid in reality. Her funeral became a spectacle both magnificent and horrifying, for the coffin was lined in crimson silk, but sealed twice against the odor. Yet even outdoors the stench leaked, forcing guards around the bier to change positions every 10 minutes lest they collapse, and flies gathered in clouds not upon the flowers but upon the coffin itself. And though the crowds who lined the streets wept at the sight of their beloved queen carried to Westminster, they did not know that within the casket the body was leaking fluids, staining the silk, and decaying so quickly that it seemed determined to erase the illusion before it could be buried. In the abbey, she was laid beside her half-sister Mary, and rumours spread that for years afterward the tomb emitted a sweet yet sickly scent, as if the poisons of her flesh had soaked into the stone, and though children learned of the Virgin Queen as a radiant figure who presided over England's glory, the truth whispered by monks and attendants was that she had rotted alive upon her throne and continued to rot even in death, her corpse as much a symbol of deception as her reign had been. Thus the last days and the spectacle of Elizabeth's death became the ultimate revelation of the paradox she embodied, that a queen could command armies, silence rivals, and dazzle poets, yet she could not command her own flesh to remain pure, and the body she tried to conquer with paint and perfume revolted in the end, bursting into decay so violent that not even the silence of death could conceal it. And in that final revolt, the illusions of a lifetime crumbled, leaving only the stench of mortality. And yet the tale does not end at the grave, for Elizabeth's legacy was built not only on her victories and her grandeur, but also on the grotesque spectacle of her decline, and in the centuries that followed her, rotting truth lingered in whispers, in letters, in rumours of odour and poison, reminding the world that even the greatest rulers are bound by the same fate as commoners, that beneath every crown lies a skull, and beneath every mask of power lies decay. And it is to this legacy of contradiction that we must turn next, to see how history remembered her not only as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, but as a woman who rotted alive in her quest to remain eternal. When the breath at last left the body of Elizabeth I in March of the year 1603, the kingdom mourned the passing of a monarch who had reigned for more than 4 decades. But those who entered her chamber and stood close to her remains did not find a peaceful corpse wrapped in velvet and serenity. They encountered a body that seemed determined to destroy every illusion she had ever built, a body that decayed with such violence that even death itself appeared impatient to strip away the lies. And so the funeral of the Virgin Queen became not only a state ceremony of magnificence, but also a grotesque contest between memory and reality, between the myth of Gloriana and the truth of a woman who had rotted alive. The embalming chamber was filled with whispers and gagging, For the morticians who peeled away the final layers of her poisoned mask gasped at the ruin beneath, cheeks riddled with abscesses, lips fused into blackened flesh, forehead flaking like parchment, eyes sunken deep into sockets ringed with blood, and the skin along her jaw and neck so fragile that it tore at the touch. And faced with this horror, they realized that the body of the queen could not be displayed as it was, for to reveal it would be to shatter the entire myth of her reign. And so they began the labor of deception, stitching, gluing, painting and covering, until the corpse resembled something serene, though beneath the lace and wax it continued to collapse into corruption. They sewed her mouth shut and covered it with rouge to give the illusion of quiet repose. They wrapped her throat in dense lace to hide the torn flesh of her jaw. They encased her hands in gloves to disguise the blackened fingers curled from poison and age. They laid a wig upon her skull heavy with powder and pearls to maintain the fiction of her fiery hair. And finally they pressed a waxen mask over her face, painted with a tranquility that the real woman had not known in years. And thus Elizabeth was transformed in death into an effigy, a mannequin of eternal youth, while the truth of her body festered beneath. The coffin was lined in crimson silk and sealed twice against the stench, yet even this barrier could not contain the odour. For as the days passed, the air within the palace grew thick with a sweetness that was not of roses but of decay. And the guards outside her chamber shifted uneasily, some collapsing, others pressing cloths steeped in vinegar to their faces. Yet still the rituals of mourning proceeded, for England could not permit the illusion to break, and so every ceremony was performed, while incense burned, while windows were shuttered, and while attendants staggered under the invisible assault of rot. When at last the coffin was carried into the streets of London, the spectacle of grandeur unfolded, with nobles in black velvet, banners embroidered with gold, and bells tolling across the city, and the people gathered in multitudes to weep for their queen. Yet they could not smell what the guards smelled, nor could they see the dark stains that had already begun to seep through the lining of the coffin, and so they cried out in grief at the sight of Majesty, never knowing that within the casket their beloved Gloriana was liquefying, her flesh collapsing, her bones soaking in the poisons that had preserved her image for so long. The guards who walked beside the bier were ordered to change positions every 10 minutes, for even outdoors the odour overwhelmed them, and eyewitnesses described clouds of flies gathering around the coffin, drawn not to the flowers scattered upon it but to the coffin itself. And yet the procession did not falter, for the pageant of monarchy demanded completion, and the tears of the people drowned out the whispers of horror that passed among those closest to the corpse. When she was borne into Westminster Abbey, the air filled with chants and incense, and she was laid beside Mary, her half-sister, the Catholic queen whose reign had been marked by blood, and together they lay in uneasy silence. But rumours spread that for years afterward a faint, sickly sweetness lingered near the tomb, as though the poisons in Elizabeth's flesh continued to exhale through stone, a haunting perfume that blurred the line between legend and decay. And though visitors left flowers believing in the purity of the Virgin Queen, those who tended the abbey knew the truth, that beneath the marble lay a body that had been destroyed long before the last breath, a body embalmed in poison and concealed beneath wax and lace. The funeral itself was magnificent in its outward form, for poets described the Queen as radiant even in death, her effigy carried aloft as a symbol of England's glory, her image painted upon banners and tapestries, her name invoked with reverence as the saviour of the realm. Yet this magnificence was built upon deception, for what the people mourned was not Elizabeth but the mask she had crafted, the illusion of eternal majesty that persisted, even as the truth of her body disintegrated. And so the funeral became the final stage in a lifelong performance, a theatre where decay was hidden behind veils and perfumes, where the corpse itself was forced into disguise, just as the living queen had forced her body into paint and wigs, and the irony was complete, that Elizabeth's greatest triumph was not the defeat of the Spanish Armada, or the expansion of her empire, but the preservation of an image so powerful that it could outshine even the stench of death. Yet whispers endured, carried by servants, by physicians, by guards who could not forget the odour that clung to their clothes, by attendants who remembered fainting in the chamber, by morticians who trembled as they stitched wax over rotting flesh. And these whispers formed an undercurrent to the official memory, a darker story that contradicted the portraits and the poems, a story of a queen who rotted alive upon her throne, and whose body betrayed her so violently that even her funeral could not disguise it. And this story, though censored in chronicles, persisted in rumour, staining the legend of the Virgin Queen with the reality of mortality. For centuries, historians celebrated Elizabeth as the Gloriana of England, the radiant Virgin Queen whose reign was a golden age, and they spoke of her cunning, her diplomacy, her victories, her art, and her faith. Yet beneath these triumphs lay the unspoken truth that she had destroyed her own body in the pursuit of illusion, that she had poisoned herself with lead and mercury, that she had turned away from water and embraced perfume, that she had crowned herself with wigs of rot, and that in the end she had decomposed faster than any queen before her, her flesh collapsing, even as the nation mourned. Thus, the funeral and the mask of legacy represent not only the end of a monarch, but also the triumph of myth over truth. For the people remembered the queen they saw in paintings and processions, not the corpse that rotted behind closed doors. And the myth proved stronger than the stench, persisting through the centuries as the face of England's greatness, while the truth lingered only in whispers, in secret letters, in the shudder of those who once stood near her coffin and never forgot the smell. And in this paradox lies the final lesson of Elizabeth's life and death. That power can command armies and shape empires, but it cannot halt the revolt of flesh, that beauty painted in poison becomes its own destruction, and that every mask, no matter how carefully crafted, eventually crumbles to reveal the rot beneath, even if only for a moment before history restores the illusion. And so Elizabeth I remains in memory not only as Gloriana, but also as the queen who rotted alive, the sovereign whose funeral was as much a masquerade as her life, and whose legacy continues to hover between splendour and decay. The funeral of Elizabeth I, wrapped in wax and velvet, sealed twice within crimson silk, and carried through the streets of London with bells tolling and banners flying, should have been the last chapter in a life spent shaping empires and commanding history. Yet what lingered after her burial was not only the myth of the Virgin Queen, but also the memory of a body that betrayed her, a body that decomposed with such ferocity that even her mourners could not wholly forget the stench. And in this contradiction, the true legacy of Elizabeth was forged, a legacy caught forever between glory and rot, between myth and mortality. Her reign was celebrated as a golden age, a time when England defeated the mighty armada of Spain, expanded trade across oceans, and became a crucible of art and literature, where poets like Shakespeare and Spenser transformed the English tongue into something immortal. And yet behind the splendour of diplomacy and conquest, behind the brilliance of speeches and the theatre of power, Elizabeth's body told another story, one of fear, vanity, and the desperate attempt to disguise decay. And this hidden story clung to her memory like a shadow, a reminder that even golden ages are haunted by the darkness of mortality. In Westminster Abbey, she was laid beside Mary, her half-sister, the Catholic queen, whose reign had been marked by blood and persecution. And together the two sisters, divided by faith and politics in life, shared a tomb in death. And some whispered that the scent of Elizabeth's poisoned flesh lingered for years around the stone, a sweet, yet sickly perfume that reminded those who entered that beneath the marble effigies of majesty lay a body corrupted by vanity and fear. And though official chronicles chose silence, the whispers endured, passed from monk to servant, from servant to traveller, until they became part of the darker folklore of England. The portraits that survive show her serene, pale, untouched by age, her lips red, her hair fiery, her figure adorned with jewels and silks. But these images are masks painted as carefully as the cosmetics she wore. Images commissioned under the threat that no artist dare reveal the truth. And so history inherited not the woman but the myth, a myth that children learned in schools, that poets enshrined in verse, that rulers after her invoked as an example of majesty. Yet beneath every brushstroke of glory lay the reality of a queen who gagged her attendants with her breath, who covered sores with lead and mercury, who crowned herself with wigs of rot, and who died a living corpse upon her throne. And so Elizabeth's legacy became a double inheritance. On one hand, the triumph of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, who embodied sovereignty, cunning, and magnificence, and on the other, the grotesque truth of a woman who rotted alive in her pursuit of eternal youth. A truth so scandalous that it was buried beneath centuries of myth, but never fully silenced. For the whispers continued, the letters of ambassadors preserved in archives, the recollections of servants recorded in secret, the horror of her physicians noted in margins, all carrying forward the darker tale that contradicted the official story. This paradox is what makes Elizabeth's legacy so enduring, for she reminds us that power itself is illusion, that even the greatest rulers depend upon masks, upon portraits, upon rituals that conceal weakness, and that the human body, indifferent to crowns and armies, will always betray the illusion, rising in revolt through rot, odour and collapse. And in this way, Elizabeth became not only the symbol of England's greatness, but also the warning of its fragility, a figure who demonstrated both the heights of political mastery and the depths of human vulnerability. Her people mourned her as divine, yet she spent her last nights terrified of closing her eyes, whispering that if she slept, she would never rise. Her lips cracked, her skin yellow, her breath thick with decay, and though they buried her with splendor, dressed in velvet and lace, crowned with pearls and gold, the truth was that she had been dead in body long before she ceased to breathe, embalmed alive by her own vanity, poisoned by her cosmetics, suffocated by her wigs, and consumed by the fear of being seen as mortal. And this truth, though hidden, makes her reign all the more tragic and all the more human. In the centuries that followed, historians celebrated her victories, poets romanticized her as the Virgin Queen, and the nation built her into a monument of pride. Yet the darker tale survived in the corners of history, reminding us that behind every myth stands a body, behind every crown, a skull, behind every portrait a woman or man struggling against the same decay that claims us all. And Elizabeth's true legacy lies not in her painted serenity, but in the contrast between what was shown and what was hidden, between the fragrance of roses and the stench of rot, between eternity promised and mortality revealed. Her death closed the Tudor dynasty, for she left no heir, and with her passed the line that had begun with Henry VII and Henry VIII, and the crown shifted to the Stuarts. Yet the shadow of her reign remained, a ghost that haunted English identity, a symbol invoked in times of triumph and crisis alike. And though the people remembered her as radiant Gloriana, the whispers of her poisoned flesh continued to rise like incense from her tomb, carrying the reminder that empires are built on illusions, and illusions always crumble. Thus, the legacy of Elizabeth I is both magnificent and grotesque, a tapestry woven from victories at sea, flourishing arts, and political mastery, yet also from rotting teeth, poisoned skin, foul wigs, and a body that decomposed in scandal. And it is this duality that makes her unforgettable, for she was both sovereign and corpse, both goddess and ruin, both immortal in image and mortal in truth. And in that contradiction lies the lesson she leaves to history, that no mask, however carefully painted, can prevent the flesh beneath from collapsing into dust. And so as we close this tale, we return to the image with which it began, the queen who ruled an empire but stank so badly that foreign ambassadors nearly fainted, the queen whose smile was a cemetery, whose bath was a soup of rot and flowers, whose wigs crawled with insects, whose makeup consumed her flesh, whose body decomposed even before her last breath, and yet who remained upon her throne, commanding poets, generals, and nations. For this is the paradox of Elizabeth I, that power and rot lived together within her, that majesty and decay shared the same skin, and that her true legacy is not only the splendor of empire but also the inevitability of death, the truth that beneath every crown lies the same fate that claims us all.